Hi, Gugge, wie? Ist mir egal. Heute gucken wir ein Video über Holy Magic Century oder wie es in Nordamerika heißt, Quest 64. Das Nintendo 64 RPG, bevor es Zelda Ocarina of Time gab. Das Video ist auf Englisch von Computer Lab Hijinks. Und der erzählt uns mehr darüber. Und es wird für alle interessant, die Holy Magic Century kennen. Aber ihr müsst trotzdem, ne? Mitgehangen, mitgefangen. Bleibt mal dran. Wird trotzdem interessant. Ich mache mal Untertitel an und mal gucken, ob die taugen. Automatisch übersetzen. Manchmal taugen die und manchmal sind die witzig. Aber früher waren die viel schlimmer. Hauen wir mal rein und gucken wir mal.
The Tale book has been stolen. A magician named Lord Bartholomew sets out to find the thief. But after a month passes without his return, Bartholomew's son, Brian, is sent out by the Grand Abbot to investigate. Journeying across the world of Keltland, Brian must thwart a plan for mass destruction, return stolen trinkets from nearby cities, and also there's some magic orbs that mustn't fall into the wrong hands. If this sounds like a fake game from a sitcom episode or a demo game from one of those RPG Maker programs, that's because it might as well be one. In spite of this game's nearly paint-by-numbers duplication of the
Hey, also das Spiel hatte wirklich Potenzial in gewisser Weise.
RPG format, as well as its light and inoffensive tone, Quest 64 has somehow become one of the most controversial, most hotly debated Nintendo 64 games. What was initially reviewed by critics as a pretty good RPG for the N64 library has somehow begun to populate worst RPGs ever lists and find itself the subject of AVGN-style review shows. So how did this happen? What exactly is wrong with this game? Welcome to Computer Lab Hijinks, a show about games, old software, and web ephemera. This computer lab itself is a bit of a mess right now. There's a lot of stacks of paper that need to find permanent places, but oddly enough, that almost ties into this week's topic. Today we're looking at the 1998 Nintendo 64 game Quest 64, an RPG released early into the console's life. For this video, we're not going to review the game or try to capture all the discourse in one video. Rather, I'm going to talk about Quest 64 as a rare opportunity to play an unfinished game of this caliber. But not the kind of unfinished game we're used to seeing today with its buggy graphics and software crashes. Quest is a very different kind of unfinished game altogether, and one that exists in a category all
Ja, und alle, die jetzt nicht so, ich sag's nochmal dazu, bei uns hieß es Holy Magic Century, ich hab's auch Let's Play 2012. Ich würde es auch gerne nochmal Let's Playen, weil ich mag's eigentlich, aber ich wollte noch ein bisschen länger Let's Plays machen.
Its own. Game development is a notoriously secretive endeavor. NDAs are standard practice for even the most entry-level positions, unused assets are deleted rather than being carried over to new projects or sold to other studios, and games are typically only announced once they have release dates, with AAA studios starting dozens of projects every year that never see the light of day. But on very rare occasions, someone slips on a banana peel, and suddenly we learn a bit more about the creative process than we were ever meant to. And in the case of Quest 64, when I call this game unfinished, I don't mean to say that it's noticeably low effort or has obvious missing features. Rather, it's something along the lines of a handwritten banner where the letters get all jumbled up and small toward the end of the canvas. Technically complete, but you know something went horribly wrong along the way. What's remarkable about Quest 64 is how it contains the remnants of a much more complex, much more ambitious title, and most of the game's world remains intact. But some ideas were clearly left on the cutting room floor because a good chunk of this game is just empty. In this video, we're going to look at the final release version of Quest 64, at least in North America, and how its environments, negative space, and storytelling choices all point to a product that is fundamentally unfinished at the content level, rather than being glitchy or unpolished. So here we go. The game launched at a strange time for the Nintendo 64. Mario...
Überleg gerade, der Junge, der war auch irgendwas, ne? Der sollte irgendwas sein, ein wichtiger Charakter. Aber den haben sie da einfach jetzt dahingestellt und ist ein normaler NPC geworden. Irgendwie so. Es hätte ein Rivale sein sollen oder sowas.
Unfinished at the contest at a strange time for the Nintendo 64. Mario 64 and GoldenEye had been out for a while, but most of the classic games we tend to associate with the console would not launch for another few years. At this point, Ocarina of Time existed only as screenshots, which would light up cover stories and forum posts every time Nintendo held a press event. The excitement was palpable, and being a Nintendo 64 owner at this time was all about looking toward the future. As of 1998, there seemed to be an implicit promise from Nintendo that their console would eventually surpass Sony's in popularity, and that the incredible quantity of good games coming out for the PlayStation was just a temporary setback. Greater things were coming down the pipeline. Yes, your friends may have Final Fantasy and Metal Gear Solid and Gran Turismo and a version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater with actual music. But you, my friend, are gonna have the greatest gift of all. Conker's 12 Tales. With Quest 64 launching in 1998 and much of its press coverage starting in 1997, gaming journals like IGN and Nintendo Power were firm in their belief that the Nintendo 64 was capable of much more than the kinds of games that were hitting store shelves, and that someday, one fine morning, all the good stuff would eventually make its way to this console. Owners would just have to defer their happiness a little bit. In particular, PlayStation seemed to have all the good RPGs, and this is partly why Quest 64 received so much positive attention from the gaming press in the months leading up to its release. It's hard to overstate just how much hype had been generated for Quest 64. In a classic example of the console wars doing what they do.
Cooles Artwork. Noch nie gesehen. Better than Zelda. Genau.
Gaming magazines position this as the N64 owner's alternative to Final Fantasy VII. On release, the response from critics was a measured one, with most criticism targeting the game's combat system and storytelling. More on that later. Nintendo Power gave it a 6.3 out of 10 because apparently decimal points are an important metric for subjective reviews of commercial products, with their biggest issue being a lack of puzzles, lack of gameplay variety in general, and the footstep sounds. I guess they were mixed too loud over top the background music, and it was just the one footstep sound effect looped over and over.
Stört mich nicht.
IGN gave a similar review, noting in the
Moment, Mario 64 hört sich auch sehr laut und die Footsteps, also bitte.
second paragraph that Quest 64 is not a bad game at all, calling it an above-average attempt to give N64 owners what they've been asking for since the release of the system. But gradually this tone shifted. Issues of Nintendo Power leading up to July 1998 include previews, fan art, and even the issue containing its final review included a multi-page spread about some of the game's features and characters. It took up the equivalent page count of a guide for Banjo-Kazooie. But after Quest came out, it was almost radio silence. A few letters came in response to their review, and the game earned a single page in a section of the magazine covering guides to individual puzzles, but that's it. And again, I had a hard time finding any mainstream reviews that called it a bad game, much less any mention of worst RPG ever. It was just seen as a bit of a letdown, and generally lacking in fun. Above all else, Quest 64 is an unfinished game. As I established earlier, there's a level of polish in this game that we don't associate with rushed development cycles today.
Ich muss ja lachen, weil Polish, ne, vom Polnischen gerade auf Polnisch übersetzt wurde in Untertiteln, ne?
So let's talk about what that looks like. Far and away, the biggest conceptual shift in the move from 2D to 3D graphics is the introduction of perspective. The camera needs to be placed somewhere in three-dimensional space, and cover a specific field of view in ways that were implied with 2D sprites but are now geometric realities with polygonal shapes. Among other things, this means a much greater emphasis on horizon line, and the player sees whatever is directly in front of
Da wollen die drauf hinaus. Das Spiel hat oft Probleme mit der Kamera, das ist wahr.
them, rather than viewing an entire village or part of a dungeon at once, like they would in a bird's-eye view RPG. And this affected game design in a very immediate way. So the question then becomes, how does Quest 64 use perspective in the 3D space? And the answer is, with almost no consistency. Frustratingly narrow and linear pathways in dungeons will immediately lead into environments that are so open and empty that they often feel like a rendering glitch. And most of the towns look like they were designed with an overhead view in mind, such as Brannock, where a select few buildings are placed on a grid, very much in line with how towns are designed for sprite-based RPGs like Pokemon or Final Fantasy. This layout makes sense from an overhead perspective, but it doesn't translate directly into 3D, where the virtual camera shows us buildings from whatever side the character is facing. So there's overall more surfaces to show the player because the camera can turn in any direction. This meant that negative space was more pronounced, and this is exactly the reason that Nintendo opted to use fixed camera angles for places like Castletown in Ocarina of Time. 3D perspective changes everything. And if the developers don't have a space that works for this,
Vielleicht konnten die bei Nintendo bei der Entwicklung von Ocarina of Time ein bisschen gucken, was Holy Magic Century falsch gemacht hat, ne? Um Lösungsansätze zu finden. Nice.
new medium, it creates an unsettling feeling. Tight spaces like the cliffside paths in Cull Hazard have become somewhat notorious since the virtual camera struggles to make sense of collision in such a narrowly enclosed space. It's the worst example by far. Lesser evils include Mel Road, which tends to feel like a small cluster of buildings with way too much empty space on either side, giving a distinctly late 90s sense of what the kids might call a liminal space. It's geometrically awkward in ways that don't seem intentional and would make a whole lot more sense from an overhead view. This isn't to say that Quest 64 has bad visuals by any means, but in terms of camera placement, of framing, it's a far cry from the deliberate angles of Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time. To that point, in addition to the perspective and framing, there's often the issue that Quest 64 doesn't always have stuff to put in the frame. The world of Quest is famous for being quite a lot emptier than other RPGs. I'm not the first person to use the word vaporwave to describe this game, and that's because these worlds have much more negative space than we're used to seeing in games. Take this open area in one of the game's dungeons, a maze consisting of narrow pathways with absolutely nothing in the background, because of how the fog obscures anything in the distance. It's also worth mentioning that fog is pretty inconsistent in this game. Most of the overworld areas don't have a noticeable draw distance, likely due to clever layout that uses cliff sides and other barriers to fill the frame. But then sometimes this game drops you in a wide open space with no sense of a destination, and suddenly there's this wall of fog.
Hey, das ist doch gut. In der Höhle macht der Nebel Atmosphäre aus. Wenn hier der Nebel fehlen würde, würde es lamer aussehen und unschöner, finde ich. Der Nebel ist ja angemessen.
It's all over the place. And this is what I mean when I call this game empty. On the micro level, there's room after room with nothing to do, enclosed spaces with no NPCs or treasure chests, which can make the exploration a bit tedious because there's no reward. But on the macro level, the dungeons and overworld areas are also just void of stuff. A common criticism of Quest 64 is that it's easy to lose track of which direction you are facing before a battle happens. Winning a battle leads to the game pointing you back in the same direction you were already headed, but if you...
Genau. Wenn du gewinnst, dreht er sich immer dahin, wo du zuletzt hingelaufen bist, dass du nur geradeaus weiterlaufen musst. Wenn du flüchtest, dann musst du halt gucken, wohin. Du musst ja rauslaufen aus der Kampfarena, aber dann bist du da auch.
Run away from a battle, the battle system just stops and it's a bit disorienting. Given the overall lack
Ich habe mich natürlich auch schon oft genug verlaufen, ne?
of landmarks in most of the overworlds, this is very much a game that makes it easy to get lost. But on a more conceptual level, bad games exist, and they're usually not noteworthy. The reason I feel so compelled to talk about Quest 64 is that it's certainly an unfinished game, but a very high-effort unfinished game. There are a great many kinds of environments on display. The towns themselves are visually distinct, as are dungeons, and some of the overworlds include underwater spaces, feverish nightmare worlds, and this pastel cloud space that absolutely looks like a vaporwave music video. Building 3D worlds is hard, and building this many 3D worlds is a Herculean effort, not to mention each area having unique enemies, all with different attacks and animations. And there's music for each new area, unique textures. This was not an easy game to make. There is, of course, one aspect of this game in which the developers really seem to phone it in, and that's the story. Broadly, in the 32 and 64-bit era, the RPG genre had become closely associated with character-driven stories told on an epic scale. This isn't to suggest that action games or other genres were inherently less capable as delivery systems for story, or even that every RPG placed a huge emphasis on its plot. Dragon Quest comes to mind as a much less narrative-focused series than Final Fantasy. But rather, genre is a set of conventions that audience and artist both knowingly use to engage with a work. And by the late 90s, players generally expected RPGs to have rich story worlds filled with complex characters who grow over the course of the game, and face big, irreversible choices that lead into act breaks, much like we see in films and television. But Quest 64 simply isn't interested in telling a story. The player controls Brian, whose dad is missing because of something called the L-Tail book. And that's about it. There's no opening cutscene, there's no real introduction of the forces of antagonism, because those are kind of a surprise for later. You just get a bit of
Man erfährt ein bisschen was von den Charakteren, die meistens aber unwichtige Sachen reden.
An introduction from someone called the Grand Abbot, and you head off to Dondoran. And with an opening this abrupt, one might expect the plot to slowly unravel over the course of the story, with hints at the lore carefully peppered in through seemingly trivial encounters with NPCs that all add up in the game's final moments. But this just isn't the case. Each town tells us a little bit about an upcoming boss that we have to track down because they...
Ja. Die reden nur über das, was jetzt gerade bevorsteht, ne? Nicht wirklich mehr ja, warum du deinen Vater suchst oder so.
Stole a magical orb or something. But in terms of the grand arc of the story, it all happens in the last hour or so. And spoilers for the ending of Quest 64, but the game's one and only plot twist is delivered in the most anticlimactic way. The evil puppet master pulling the strings throughout the story ends up being Shannon, this somewhat random woman who shows up at the game's inn and says hello. Suddenly, she's this otherworldly malevolent force coming to immanentize the Eschaton. It's a plot point that doesn't...
Ey, aber das fanden wir damals krass, dass die in Wirklichkeit, ne, die hat sich immer teleportiert von Stadt zu Stadt und auf einmal kommt raus, die ist böse oder wird gesteuert vom Bösen.
Make an impression because this game doesn't have any characters worth having feelings about. Which is to say, I don't think this is the exact game that the developers set out to make. Nobody writes a story this inept on purpose. I mentioned before that game development is a tight-lipped industry, and Imagineer has never come out and explicitly said what might have been cut from this game late in development. But between magazine previews and the final product, there's a few hints as to what might have been lost. One of the most notable examples is Leo DiNardo, a character mentioned in a lot of the pre-release press coverage, who seems to have been intended as a personal rival to the protagonist, along the lines of Gary from Pokemon. By all accounts, he was meant to show up several times throughout the story, or possibly even serve as one of multiple playable characters in the game, like a party member, but that just didn't happen, and Leo only shows up twice throughout the entire game. The first appearance is incredibly easy to miss and has no bearing on the main story, and the second appearance happens near the end of the game. It's also pretty insignificant. He lets
Du kannst bei dem speichern und du denkst so, warum steht da jetzt ein anderes Kind?
the player save their game and refill their health and magic, and that's it. Likewise, there's a curious lack of cutscenes or any story elements which take control of the camera to emphasize a particular moment. It's clearly possible within the game's code, as every boss battle begins with the camera cutting to a wide shot of the room and the boss says something menacing. But this doesn't seem to happen anywhere else in the game. And the ending, which, believe it or not, consists of a harsh cut to a scrolling text epilogue in the North American and European releases, was somewhat more fleshed out for the Japanese release a year later, with some actual in-game dialogue, but it still doesn't add up to much. There's also a...
Guck mal, die japanische Version hat ein bisschen mehr
in-game
Texte am
dialogue,
Ende.
but it's still...
I pray that you're safe somewhere, Brian. Spirits, please watch over him. Also der Vater ist immer noch da am Schloss und liegt da halb tot rum. Oder ist er gestorben?
Doesn't add up to much.
Ja.
There's also a completely optional and incredibly easy to miss conversation in this desert environment with a magician named Lavar that
Vor allen Dingen sind da so viele Spirits, da willst du unbedingt hin.
really should have been part of the main quest because it's perhaps one of only 3 places in the game where any part of the story is delivered. And just to illustrate how easy it is to miss this encounter entirely, I've actually never found it in any of my playthroughs of the game, hence the borrowed footage with the weird text rendering glitch. Quest 64 story consists of a lot of boilerplate fantasy world-building stuff that's rarely unique enough to be memorable, but for some reason, out of absolutely nowhere, we get this cosmic horror from Lavar that I feel the need to excerpt here because it's just so tonally jarring and I kind of love it. Quote, "What have we here? No one has found this phantom city in 1,000 years. I am Lavar. I once held the Eltale book, but when I opened it to unleash its incredible powers, I was not worthy. The only powers I could control were those of famine and destruction. I could hate but not love. I could terrify but not inspire. My penance is that I have been exiled here, alone for eternity, or until the evil that we call Mammon is defeated. Only then will I find my final peace." And again, this chunk of text isn't referenced anywhere else in the game, and it's in a part of the map that requires a significant detour to access. It's a place that the vast majority of players won't ever see, and it takes place.
Ja, haben wir schon gefunden, aber du musst ganz komisch durch die Wüste laufen. Also eigentlich geht der Weg so geradeaus und dann kannst du rechts in die Wüste, wo du denkst, da passiert nichts. Aber wenn du da weiterläufst in einem bestimmten Winkel, kommst du bei dem Palast raus. Ja, kann man dich am Ende noch zeigen, wie da erlöst wird, weil du Mammon besiegt hast?
In this intricately modeled structure with rooms and trinkets and a Lovecraft villain telling you about his 1,000-year spirit jail and how you're the only one who can save him from eternal conscious torment. It represents a lot of work. Again, I suspect that the developers created and modeled a rather large game world with vibrant and unique areas whose character models often point to an overly optimistic planning stage. This character, named Leela, hangs out in the Larapool Inn and then moves to another building after a certain point in the story, all in the purpose of opening a door off-screen when the player talks to her. That's all she does. There's a couple of dialogue windows and then you run off to the next dungeon. But looking at her character model, it obviously shows effort, and certainly a lot more effort than the game's default woman NPC, who undoubtedly represents the worst 3D modeling in the entire game. But with Leela, I'm confused for altogether different reasons.
Ja, zeigt doch nicht so eine pixelige Variante, macht das noch hochgerendert. Also im Emulator besser dargestellt.
Her amount of visual detail is at odds with her level of importance in the overall game. If Quest 64 was a...
Ich habe das auch schon mal gezeigt. Auf Twitter gibt es so einen Quest 64-Account, dem folge ich, mit den krassen Facts und so, immer wieder lustig.
Project where whole gameplay systems were abandoned at the 11th hour to hit a deadline, then why does Leela look like someone spent an entire week designing, modeling, texturing, and rigging a character for this 15 seconds of gameplay? I suspect more was intended. More than anything, I
Das waren keine 15 Sekunden.
think this was the result of a weird workflow, an understandably chaotic creative process given the brand new era of 3D graphics. Nowadays, just about everyone in the games industry knows to work with temporary assets and get all the level design and narrative work done before they start the laborious process of generating full quality models. But hey, this was 1997 and the rules were still being written. Maybe Imagineer started by building all the character models and then...
Wo haben denn die Charaktere, die Models her und mit was für einem Programm tun die das da? Hä?
ran out of time to implement all the dialogue they wanted, or program a currency system, or build side quests. I have no idea how they made this game, but the more I look at it, the more questions I have. And to that end, what you get out of playing Quest 64 depends a great deal on what you put into it. It doesn't emulate well using the default settings on most emulation software. This text rendering glitch is kind of infamous. It demands a lot of patience with its high encounter rate and long stretches of repetitive overworld design. Most of the dungeons in the game's second half are, at minimum, a full hour longer than they should be, and the story doesn't add up to anything at all. But there's still something there, and for those who care to look, the artifacts of a more ambitious game are still present, and that's unusual for a release with this relative level of polish. That's ultimately the beauty of a game like this. The more magazine articles you read, the more commentary you check online, and the more of the game itself you experience, the less anything makes concrete sense. And that's exactly why I recommend everyone play Quest 64. It's unfinished, but in the weirdest way possible. Thank you for watching Computer Lab Hijinks. Normally this is a show where I like to fill in gaps in research and cover topics that may not have been covered on YouTube at all. But in the case of Quest 64, it's a pretty crowded subject, and I just love this game so much that I had to make a video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Nathan telling you to keep your files safe, keep your passwords managed, and for goodness sake, don't click on any strange links. I'll see you in a week.
Sagt er wahre Worte. Ja, starkes Video, ein bisschen was gelernt und es ist wahr. Und das ist auch die Erklärung. Es hätte jetzt nochmal concluden können, es hätte jetzt nochmal zusammenfassen können. Und zwar, das Spiel hat damals nicht sehr schlechte Wertungen bekommen. Damals wusste man nicht besser. Man wusste nicht so richtig wie Cutscenes oder all das, ne? Man wusste, die ganze 3D-Sache war komplett neu und man musste sich selbst überlegen, wie setzen wir das um. Ja, heute gibt es ganz klare Regeln, wie das auszusehen hat. Und aus dem Grunde wirkt es heute noch viel altbackener, als es damals war. Ich hatte es zu N64-Zeiten ausgeliehen bekommen, zu frühen N64-Zeiten, also als es wirklich neu war. Und die Welt, die Umgebung, es war alles sehr faszinierend und sehr begeistert. Und ich hat auch Monate, ich glaube sogar Jahre gedauert, bis ich das weiter und weiter bis zum Ende gespielt hatte. Weil es auch ein sehr langes Spiel ist, ja, lang gestreckt auch, ne? Aber ein Kampfsystem hat coole Ansätze, läuft aber darauf hinaus, wenn du erstmal weißt, wie es geht, ne, konzentriert sich auf Wasser zu boosten für Heilung und danach starker Angriff mit Stein, Feuer und vor allen Dingen Windelemente. Tut man ja gar nicht wirklich leveln, das ist schade. Ja, hier, es gibt nicht mal eine Währung, du kannst nicht mal Tränke oder so kaufen. In jeder Stadt gibt es irgendwelche Läden oder Sachen, da hättest du wenigstens irgendwas, das wäre wirklich kein Ding gewesen. Du hättest wenigstens was kaufen können zum Heilen oder so, ne? I'm the leader of the Project 64 Decompilation Project. Wir sind zu 50% fertig. Mein Ziel ist es, das Spiel auszufüllen und hoffentlich machen wir das, was es mal sein sollte. Und ich bin wirklich froh, dass Leute jetzt darüber reden. Vor 3 Jahren. Brian uses doors with style. Wie denn? Hä? Ach, der dreht sich. Das sieht jetzt noch nicht so vielversprechend aus. Und hier sehe ich schon, der normale Gegner setzt so eine Feuerattacke ein. Das ist verrückt. Naja gut, da freuen wir uns mal nicht zu früh. Man kennt das Problem. Aber... Hä?
The L-Tail Book.
Aber das klingt cool, von 9 Tagen. Und die letzten Videos waren vor 3 Jahren. Ja. Und damals haben die halt doch so mittelmäßige Wertung gegeben, weil die wussten es auch nicht sehr viel besser, ne? Also die hatten echt was vor, nur die mussten es halt auch rausbringen und so. Ist alles schade. Idee von der Story und das Spiel. Ja, es ist leer. Sehr viele Orte. Da haben einfach die Leute sehr viel dran gearbeitet, die Städte und diese Charaktere, sag ich mal, zusammenzubauen. Aber was dann am Ende mit gemacht wurde, fehlte, glaube ich, die Vision. Ach ja. Ich mag's. Auch wenn es wirklich, muss ich ehrlich sein, dass auch nicht irgendwie ein Nachfolger oder so erschienen ist. Ich habe einen Let's Test zur Game Boy Color Version. Da wollen wir gar nicht drüber reden. Leute, aber ich hab's gefallen. Ich habe das Video sehr enjoyed. Ich hoffe, ein paar, die zugeschaut haben, was macht er denn sonst so? Scheint auf jeden Fall ein sehr kompetenter Kanal zu sein. Leute, dann sehen wir uns beim nächsten Mal wieder. Und ich sag, vielleicht einen Daumen nach oben, das wäre cool. Gute!